Hello, welcome to this latest instalment of the Edinburgh Fortean Society Online. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gordon Rutter and I'm the organiser of the Edinburgh Fortean Society group. We normally meet on the second Tuesday of every month, and we normally meet in real life, and we meet in the pub at 7:30 in the evening, and we have talks, and we've been trying to keep that going throughout these current times, and we've managed it so far. So thank you to everyone who's contributed to the talks, and thank you to everyone who's come along and listened to them as well. Tonight's talk is a speaker who, quite frankly, we wouldn't normally get for geographical reasons. I don't know why it didn't occur to me earlier on, but this is a perfect opportunity to use people from all around the world as speakers. So tonight's speaker is our first in a series potentially of speakers from around the world, and tonight's speaker is Sharon A. Hill, and she will be talking on spooky geology, and she's from the States. So thank you very much, Sharon.
Hello, Edinburgh Fortean Society and visiting viewers. My name is Sharon Hill, and thank you for joining me for my talk on spooky geology. Well, what is spooky geology? Well, I was inspired by Jeb Card's idea of spooky archaeology, where he looked into the inherent qualities of archaeological subjects that create results for those with supernatural, esoteric, and occult views. I asked him if I could use this framing for the science of geology, and he said sure I could, so here I am. But I am a geologist, and my focus has mostly been on the public aspects of science, and I look at sociological aspects of communicating scientific ideas for public good. I also am a lifelong fan of paranormal subjects and have done independent research on the topics of, and people interested in, ghosts, hauntings, cryptozoology, UFOs, parapsychology, and anomalous phenomenon for the past 25 years or so. I've written a book on the culture of paranormal researchers and how they use science, and I also collected thousands of stories over 7 years for my previous website, Doubtful News. I'm here today to talk about the eerie, unsettling, and unusual and uncanny ideas about the Earth. I feel it's quite appropriate to be discussing this with the society located in one of the birthplaces of the scientific field. James Hutton, born in 1926 in Edinburgh, was a key founder of modern geology, and he used locations and features in Scotland to understand and explain several basic geologic processes. Notably, he used Sticker Point, which is often referred to as one of the most important locations, linked to the birth of the fundamental geologic concepts every Earth scientist still learns today. So believe me when I say I am very sad that I cannot be with you in person, so hopefully someday I can. But in this talk, please be my guest in walking through an array of topics to illustrate this intersection of geology and the strange anomalies, concepts, phenomenon, and circumstances. Spooky geology is my framing for thinking about the interaction between uneasy and unnatural ideas about the Earth and what is known through the sciences. It's also a website and a YouTube channel where I collect and explain what I found to those of you who may find this mixing of odd concepts interesting. The general subject area covers Earth mysteries, weird locations, and anomalous phenomenon. It's a science-based look at mysterious Earth phenomenon, geologic anomalies, and the endless list of abnormal, paranormal, or supernatural ideas about rocks and the Earth. It's a different way to explore geology and Earth happenings from a different angle: legendary, mythical, supernatural. Recall that science is a relatively new invention for humans. Before that, the Earth was scary and mysterious, and as we'll see, it often still is. When I thought of this framing, I looked and found that no one else was doing this at this scope and level. And there are some academic papers and some areas of research into very specific areas that I'll cover here, but nothing comprehensive. A very few have looked into the idea of dark geology, that is, related to death or evil, but it's pretty broad and shallow. And there is an area called geomythology that connects folklore and legend to the landscape. To cover each topic, I look at the popular ideas about it and contrast those with the scientific knowledge about it. Sometimes those two arenas entirely conflict, but often there is a good bit of overlap where you can see why people think how they did. It's also frequently necessary to check folklore studies and, when I'm able, to do in-person investigation. I get inspiration and information from news stories and the media, Fortean Times, of course, William Corliss catalogs, geology journals, folklore literature, and any popular and scholarly sources. So for each subject, I go a bit deeper into the academic literature, probably more, say, than a paranormal investigator might go, and probably more than most Forteans might go. I'm looking for the path that takes one through the story that's being told. It's not easy and it's not quick, and it takes me a long time to do one entry. So, as you'll see, there is so very much ground to cover that I can never exhaust the subject, even in a whole lifetime. I attempted to break the broad categories down into smaller ones. I'm still unsatisfied with the boxes I've created because so many stories and topics cross over the boundaries, and I've not yet figured out the deeper connections between them. And maybe that's not possible because they interact at their most basic level. The big categories, which I'll go over and provide some examples, will give you a sense of what I mean with my vision of this framing of geology as spooky. There's always been myths and legends to explain nature, endless stories about how the earth and its features and products came to be. So the folklore aspect is key to understanding not just old tales, but modern folklore and legends. 21st century ideas about the world are important because people interact with their surroundings today and project their own interpretations onto it. Notably, as the popularity of re-enchantment of the landscape grows, we see more personal meaning injected into narratives about rock and the earth. Science is one way of knowing about the earth. We have many other ways to make this type of connection and gain understanding. Alternative geology. This is a really big category that encompasses all manner of ways to explain the earth and its features that aren't science-based or acceptably scientific. Before geology was an organized area of study, people assumed that the earth and everything on it was created by a supernatural power, good or evil. Many of these themes have paranormal or supernatural qualities. Alternative views about what we know of the Earth include the planet as being flat, hollow, or a few thousand years old. In a crossover with archaeology, there are serious geological factors at play with claims of lost continents, sunken cities, and massive floods. Ever popular, just beyond the mainstream, is the idea that the Earth will self-destruct at any time, perhaps by the breakdown or reversing of the inner workings, for example, a pole shift that will create worldwide chaos. But there are some popular sources that rely on stoking fear of catastrophic geologic processes that will signal end times are upon us. Apocalypticism is alive and well and relies on the misunderstanding by the general public of normal natural processes. And there are also some non-science ways of knowing. There is a crossover here with other categories of spooky geology, but the idea that you could read rocks in a way other than scientifically, such as psychically, through occult forces, perhaps, that's pretty interesting. I have not yet dipped too far into ideas about sacred geometry in nature, but I regularly access mythology and folklore of striking geologic settings as it reflects how people always had a spiritual connection to the earth and earth products. Finally, the idea that the earth itself is a living entity, as in the Gaia hypothesis, and other personifications of the earth as a giver of life, our mother, is a different and highly spiritual way of seeing the planet, not something that's covered with a geology degree, but it's an important part of how people connect to their environment and try to make sense of nature. So on the right, here are some topics that I have explored on the Spooky Geology site. So let's talk about a few specifics. Flat Earth is an example of alternative geology. I did a feature on flat Earth. It's a concept that is both non-intuitive and intuitive. That is, for human prehistory, we really didn't care about it, and when you looked around, you couldn't readily conclude that you were on a convex surface. But it has become a basic natural fact, and our global civilization as we know it relies on the roundness as an assumed universal truth. Yet, some people choose to reject this. The concept of flat Earth was bandied about in the past for interesting and not always obvious reasons. It was on the rise again beginning in about 2015. My views of the popularity of being contrarian about the most basic of Earth's features is not because of a lack of science education or of people just being dumb, but its roots are in that distrust of authority and being told what to think. And in that respect, I think it's very much in line with the rise of conspiracy thinking. Also, people want to feel special, so they like the sense of special knowing that comes with being a conspiracy believer. I recommend this book by Christine Garwood, Flat Earth, The History of an Infamous Idea. It's more complicated than most people think. It's spooky to think that the Earth doesn't care about us little people on its surface, but the fear of catastrophes that will be so devastating that all life could end is not a fringe idea. People really fear the earthquake of magnitude 10 or the breakup of tectonic plates that sends land sinking into the ocean or volcanoes that could suddenly erupt out of nowhere. And I think that if people understood more about geology and how the Earth works, they'd be both less frightened of these exaggerated threats, but possibly more frightened of other things that are actually dangerous. The end times ideas, so prevalent in certain corners of the internet that often incorporate Fortean phenomenon as signals, also betray the difficulty people have in thinking in terms of deep time that's in millions and billions of years. What if we could psychically read rocks instead of doing all sorts of physical tests on them? In 1863, geologist and spiritualist William Denton declared that certain people can hold a rock and psychically see its history, its origin. A pebble rounded by the waves still retains the rolling sensation. The piece of coal telegraphs its origin as a prehistoric swamp. Put your hands in a fossilized footprint trace and you would know the animal that made it. Unbelievable and nonsensical. It didn't work, but it was a nifty idea about nature that was personal and human-centered. This communication between humans and inorganic material still holds great value, as we will see with another idea about haunted locations, and also similar to the fringe idea of morphic resonance, the idea of inherited systemic memory. And certainly, it's still used by some mediums today, psychometry that is, to tell sitters about the person who owned or used various objects. One of the earliest stories I covered on my previous Doubtful News website was that of Russian scientists, air quotes, who were convinced that crinoid fossils, very common, like the ones seen here, were in fact ancient wheels or gears from machinery. One can find thousands of similar examples of naive interpretations of fossils as something they are most certainly not. But they look like something more modernly familiar. So often these ideas are pressed by young earthers, creationists, who seem to think that a few samples they view as definitive anomalies can overturn geology as a science and all of established knowledge as we know it. And there are plenty of genuine anomalies to figure out. It's very silly when these non-anomalies, pushing other agendas, are accepted as valid and baffling to science. They're just not. But people will seek to match a pattern they know. And thus these crinoid disks that they'd never seen before easily become gears, and therefore they conclude by seeing with their own eyes that rocks of the earth must be very young. Next is Earth Mysteries. This category is one of my favorites, and I've written about a number of these topics already, and I continue to learn more. At first, I thought about making Earth energies its own category because so many topics were connected to the idea that there is some unseen, undocumented force emanating from the Earth that people could tap into or were affected by. And this gives us the ideas of dowsing, lays or ley lines, energy vortexes. It also connected to that energy as the possible beacon of it, Earth lights. But there is also the super popular New Age idea of crystal power, crystals that heal or channel some life force or good feelings or ward off curses or illness. And there are plenty of places that are said to have waters that have special powers. Under the general term of Earth mysteries, I include the idea of oracle locations where the Sibyls communed with spirits. And there are volumes on geologic anomalous phenomenon that remain unexplained, notably my favorite, those related to earthquakes and their precursors or associated weirdness. And finally, we still hear today about how people feel things from the Earth in terms of geopathic stress. I wrote a fun piece on gravity roads, magnetic hills, and mystery spots that supposedly have some geologic basis. But as I said, many of these concepts flow into each other, but one of the earliest and necessary topics to cover was dowsing. This topic is certainly the one that provides the most vehement comments and responses. I write very skeptically on dowsing, so I always get commenters who reply that they know it's real and nothing else matters, especially what I say. It's almost a topic where it doesn't pay to write about because the views are entirely polarized. And in more than just that way, it is a political subject. It's related to class and belief and culture. Those who could dowse, for example, were highly valued in their rural societies and even are used for the same jobs today. But as a geologist who works with well drillers and mining, I know firsthand that dowsers are not called on to make actually critical decisions. Yet many of my engineering friends still believe that one can reliably dowse for water or mineral veins or pipelines or some such. However, the explanations for dowsing have proven to be invalid, and the testing just has not been successful. And that doesn't stop the idea of water witching still being seen as a venerable skill by many, at least in the Appalachian area of the U.S. Dowsing is a gigantic topic that one could study for a lifetime, I think, just to grasp all the marvelous psychological, social, and economical angles to it. Dowsing has also been associated with ley lines. In the U.S., we mostly call them ley lines, but I was corrected by someone in the U.K. to say that they are lays. Years ago, at a paranormal convention, a ghost hunter who was professing some very sciencey mumbo-jumbo found out that I was a geologist, and he asked me about ley lines and hauntings. And I hadn't heard of the connection with ghosts at that time. But there followed months and months of research into it, with Alfred Watkins and the Old Straight Track as a start, and of course that generally down-to-earth concept of tracks went off in some wild directions not too long after. I had only heard of lays in association with strange locations, areas of high strangeness, and so-called earth energies. I did make an effort to see if people were interpreting geologic lineaments, which are real structural features, with lays, and it didn't appear that they were. But it did seem like they were loosely connecting points on a map. And depending upon how thick you draw the line, you could connect some interesting spots. Coincidentally, I was watching the third Ghostbusters movie several months after it was released, while I was still stewing on the ghosts and ley lines issue. And there it was, laid out right before my eyes. Lays were used as the plot device. They were explained in the movie as the paths of paranormal energy. So shortly thereafter, I wrote up the piece and was able to include this timely reference. Supposedly, where the lays cross, there are energy vortexes or vortices. I have lots of references to dig into to write up a piece on this, but the idea of vortices I was familiar with was Ivan Sanderson's vial vortices. But the concept is still pretty popular. And here's a map from the Vortex Hunters website from a few years ago showing some dubious crowd-submitted vortex mystery spots. Fortunately, in 2015, I was able to visit a very well-known vortex hotspot in the US, Sedona, Arizona. Here I am at Bell Rock. The climate, scenery, the smell of the air, it's all just so amazing here that it's easy to feel buoyant and energized or even dizzy from the surroundings. So the vortex concept kind of made a little more sense. The downtown of Sedona is simply a fascinating, colorful, and interesting place. And they do capitalize on paranormal tourism, playing up the aspect of the New Age spiritualism and Native American mysticism. When I got home, I found I'd captured my very own blue vortex on film among the twisted juniper bushes. I'd go back there again in a second just to experience it all over again. One of my most memorable trips, and one that truly helped me understand why people find such profound meaning in the landscape and the geology. Moving on to another of my favorite topics that no geologist I knew of had covered, with good reason, the stone tape. This is the concept that minerals in rock or building materials can capture human emotional energy and play back past events under certain circumstances. I was somewhat familiar with the idea, but finally I got access to this marvelous TV movie that had a huge influence in popularizing the concept. But then I had to go and read T.C. Lethbridge to see the origin of the idea, and it's got all twisted up in psychometry, which is very similar, the psychic ether, and with people who are sensitive to these claimed energy fields. It was important for me to see what the many paranormal investigators said about stone tape because it was definitively used in the American TV show Ghost Hunters. Thousands of amateur groups repeated what these guys said without question. And what they said was gibberish about granite, limestone, and quartz as part of this entirely untested theory. These were claims about the bedrock that I could easily check, and I found they were all wrong. I sought out as many sources as I could find, going back into the SPR journal archives. There wasn't much, but stone tape is such an awesome idea to explain place memories and residual hauntings that it's endured just on the speculation. It just sounds so sciencey that people want to use it. So I have a video on the stone tape theory on the Spooky Geology YouTube channel for you to see more and what I said about it there. A reasonable next step from the stone tape is to Michael Persinger's tectonic strain theory, where stresses from faulted areas were proposed to produce holograms and feelings in certain people living on the surface above. These visions or feelings could be interpreted as paranormal events. That was his idea. Persinger attempted to tie this also into lights, UFOs, ghosts, and other paranormal phenomenon. Unfortunately, it just didn't pan out. It's a testable idea, but it failed the tests. And the mechanisms were, again, highly speculative. However, like the stone tape idea, it sounded sciencey and plausible to audiences without scientific background, and it's still used frequently by amateur ghost hunters as an explanation for strange occurrences. There really is no basis for that. A few other investigators have asked me to consult local geologic information to confirm the presence of faults, karst geology, or quartz-bearing rock in association with a haunted location. And it's fair to say that I never found any evidence that geology played a role in paranormal experiences. But I'm not done looking yet. I love the topic of earth lights. There are several variations of them, and they intersect with ideas about earth energies, UFOs, hauntings, and areas of high strangeness. The tectonic strain theory was not considered nonsense in one respect. There were several scientists, even some seismologists, who were studying the possibility that the stresses produced in a rock prior to a fault rupture could cause a glow or balls of light to be emitted from the ground surface. Now, here was a rabbit hole I eagerly jumped into for well over a year, reading every geophysical paper I could get on electromagnetic readings associated with earthquakes. I had previously written a general, wide-ranging piece on earthquake precursors for The Anomalist, Volume 13. Along the way, the person who organizes speakers for the NASA Goddard Science Colloquium series found me online and asked me to speak on earthquake lights, which he said was a highly requested topic that he could not find a volunteer to do. Well, I was not going to turn down this speaking opportunity, but that meant convincing actual space engineers and physicists that there was something worth talking about with regards to earthquake lights, and made me pretty nervous. But I'm happy to say that the talk was extremely well received, and the video is also available on the Spooky Geology YouTube site. And then later, I adapted the work for a post on the Spooky Geology website, and also a feature article for Fortean Times in 2019. Here are the Hessdalen lights in Norway as another example of earth lights that may or may not be associated with earth stresses. Some of you may know that I am a former science consultant for SciCop CSI, and earthquake lights, as well as ball lightning and earth lights in general, was an area where I was very intrigued with the possibilities that they could be real and be a scientific breakthrough, something brand new. But my skeptical colleagues were pretty completely closed to these ideas. I still don't know what's going on here, and the evidence has unfortunately not been all that impressive, but I do love to follow the reports, and I find it really interesting. Earth lights in general are rather out of vogue, but not entirely gone away. There still are several locations that capitalize on their legendary lights for tourism purposes at least. This is the JOPLIN SPOOK light in Missouri in the days when an evening drive was the thing to do on a Saturday night. Again, this is a subject where the references are few. I even contacted Paul Devereaux to ask him if he could recommend resources, as I felt like I'd exhausted them all. There continues to be a repetition of popular news accounts of places like Marfa, Texas, where the reports and potential causes for the lights are misunderstood or exaggerated. And frankly, it appears that genuine accounts of earth lights are really rare, but people will misidentify optical illusions from man-made lights as mystery lights to the point that their strangeness gets negated. In the U.S., locations like Brown Mountain in North Carolina were studied by the U.S. Geological Survey decades ago, but the conclusion was unsatisfying. I still have to write more on earth lights and visit more of these places to see firsthand. Well, hopefully I'll see something. Let me hit one more point on the subject of earthquakes and faults. I have yet to sort through all the fascinating findings of ancient Greece, where various locations, now linked to gas-emitting faults, were in the past, temporarily at least, magical places where the Pythia, the high priestess of the Temple of Apollo, served as an oracle who channeled messages from the god himself. More recent findings at Delphi about the composition of the hydrocarbons emitted from the faults and the types of hallucinations they may have caused the Pythia are spooky geology indeed. In other locations, a Sibyl, another prophetess, served as an oracle of the dead. I was introduced to the widespread use of oracles at geologically active locations through an article by Mike Dash, where he described the necromantion of Baiae in Italy. The geologic conditions here led to fantastic ideas about communing with the spirits of the dead. Caves and an elaborate tunnel system was created at Baiae, and it may have been interpreted as possibly being a place where one could make a literal visit to the underworld. Moving on to more evident geological dangers, there are plenty of places on Earth, in the present and in the past, that are natural death traps. Geologic hazards are well known. Ground fissures, landslides, and sinkholes make for a dramatic visual of a dynamic Earth surface. Quicksand, a formerly wildly popular method of putting movie and TV characters in mortal peril, is real and can be found in many places around the world. We were reminded of the acute dangers of caves a few years ago when a group of kids were trapped in a cave in Thailand when their escape route was rapidly flooded after a rain event. Other hazards that people may not think about are natural gas emissions of various kinds that can and have silently killed many people. Some of these gases are radioactive. On the right in green is a list of subjects I've written about so far. For my real-life career, I spend far too much time trying to solve sinkhole issues, so that is my particular area of expertise. But let's take a quick look at 4 other examples of hazards. This is Batagai. It's known as a mega slump. It's in the Yakutia area of Siberia, and it's the result of the permafrost melting and collapsing, exposing soil hundreds of thousands of years old in the process. Researchers have found artifacts and mummified animals here. The crater continues to grow in a self-feeding process. Incidentally, this was not created by a warming climate necessarily, but by clear-cutting that ended up exposing the ground surface to thawing from the sun, and then things grew worse from there. Superstitions of the area include tales that this is the mouth of hell. If this monster was encroaching on your village, you might think so too. Darvaza is also called a mouth of hell. This is also a disaster perpetuated by man and fueled by the natural geology. This 230-foot wide, 66-foot deep, gaping, burning pit is in the desert of Turkmenistan, where in 1971, Soviet scientists drilling for oil and gas caused the crater to collapse. Someone thought it would be a good idea to burn off the methane from the pit, and it never burned out. The huge methane store has burned for more than 4 decades. The pit has become a tourist attraction. When people extract too much water from underground aquifers, the ground cracks and settles. This is what's happening in places like Arizona, Saudi Arabia, and in this photo, Hermosillo, Mexico. As these very old aquifers are drained, there is not equivalent recharge. These areas will run out of fresh water. The giant fissures are a very clear warning. When the rain does come, the shrunken clay soils are washed out of the fissures, enlarging them and threatening homes, livestock, and even whole towns. Lake NYOS in Cameroon has at its bottom some vents from magma deep below. The gases emitted from these vents, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and methane, slowly diffuse into the water. At some point, the water gets supersaturated with gas, but the upper layers prevent the gas from escaping. A small trigger can destabilize the system of layers and cause the lake to violently degas. That's what happened in 1986. 1,800 people living in a 15-mile radius of the lake died from suffocation as the heavy gas displaced oxygen. Local people had told stories of death from the lake, but the degassing is unpredictable and long-term. Today, vent pipes disperse the bottom gas to avoid reoccurrence of such a catastrophe. Paranormal places. This is a really fun category. It also overlaps with other categories, as the places are often tied to concepts of earth mysteries or energies. I have many entries on various devil-named places. Get ready for some from the list. Devils' dens, canyons, lakes, gardens, gates, holes, playgrounds, hop yards, kitchens, tea tables, punch bowls, potato patches, marble yards, and racetracks. Not to mention elbows, windpipes, backbones, peaks, knobs, forks, and bathtubs. I've not nearly covered all such places. One could spend a lifetime just categorizing them all. Related to devil places, there are many gates to hell and bottomless pits. Many of these places are also cursed or said to be haunted, but there are often geological reasons behind the sinister nature of such places. I've already mentioned the geological, not actually valid ideas about why places might be haunted, tectonic strain theory and stone tape. Also included in paranormal places category are mining superstitions. There are plenty of haunted caves and mines. I've so far covered the places and topics listed on the right, and let's take a quick trip to visit some of them. There are many locations around the globe that are said to be gates to hell. I previously described Darvaza and Batgai, called the Hellmouth Crater, but there are so many more reported gates to hell. Logically, volcanic places that spew smoke, melted rock, and smell of sulfur were historically imagined as connections to hell. Besides Scotland, which is on my list of pilgrimage places, Iceland is on my list of geologically must-see places. All of Iceland is volcanic, but Hekla was known to Europeans as a gateway to hell in medieval times because of its frequent and large eruptions. This 1585 depiction describes Hekla as a place that, quote, vomits stones under terrible noise. Legends said that people saw souls flying in the eruption fires and that witches gathered here. To a geologist, Hekla sounds more like heaven than hell. Devil's Den in Gettysburg National Military Park in Pennsylvania is one of many similarly named places around the world. It's also a mecca for ghost hunters. Not long ago, there were no less than a dozen ghost tours in this small historic town where the tide of the American Civil War changed in 1863. The geology of the battlefield was instrumental in the outcome, as soldiers could not dig trenches, but staked out the two ridges and sharpshooters hid among these diabase boulders. Paranormal investigators used the idea of the stone tape ad nauseum here, often noting that the quartz in the rock is the catalyst for the many reported apparitions cited here. Apparently, they never asked a geologist, because these intrusive rocks are notoriously quartz poor. The stone tape assumptions all fail miserably at Gettysburg, but that doesn't stop it from being a paranormal hotspot. And if any viewer wants to take a geologic tour of this location for their visit, please look me up as it's fairly local to me. A quintessential devil place that actually has nothing to do with the devil is Devil's Tower in Wyoming. The structure is so iconic, it was its own character in the 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The narratives of a magical, powerful landmark melded just perfectly with the idea of a landing site for extraterrestrials. As you can expect, the formation, another igneous intrusion that was more resistant to erosion than the surrounding rock, was sacred to the indigenous peoples. The rock body has columnar jointing, as found in Fingal's Cave and in Giant's Causeway, as well as the Devil's Postpile in California. In the legend of the tower, historically known as Bear Lodge, the Great Spirit saved some children from a giant bear by raising the ground into the sky as the bear clawed the rock, leaving the marks. There is considerable history and lore surrounding this site, but the UFO angle seems to have run its course for now. In 2017, a UFO-themed meetup was held at the site. The event didn't continue, but the site still serves as a pilgrimage location for nature lovers, geologists, film buffs, Native Americans, and artists. And for more, you can check out my video about Devil's Tower at the Spooky Geology YouTube channel. Last year around this time, I visited Moodus, Connecticut, where I met up with a local professor who gave me an expert tour of Mount Tom and the surrounding area, which is where the Moodus noises supposedly originate. This site is so perfectly epitomizes spooky geology. It was wonderfully informative. But the legend itself is so culturally and politically complex, there are many layers. The booming noises come from the ground and have been known for centuries, even by the natives. As with many legends in North America, the white colonists misinterpreted the native tales, made the gods into the devil himself. Other permutations of the story later incorporated ideas of witches, a hidden carbuncle growing in the earth that made the noises, a learned man, some say an alchemist, who came from Europe to fix the problem, but later was lost at sea with the gem he extracted from the nearby river. Here I am at the Cave of the Winds, which many websites mistakenly say is on Mount Tom. It's on private property, and it's not a cave as much as it is a space between boulders. Later stories said that the noises came from this cave, which was so deep it led to a hidden cavern and eventually to the river itself. There was so much mystery, magic, devilry, and outright fiction in the Moodus lore that not many had really ever connected all the threads together with geology. This place was magical and spooky. but I didn't hear the famed noises. These are caused by very shallow, localized earthquakes, of which the specific physical causes are still unknown, so I certainly need to keep going back there. Let's revisit quartz one more time, the most magical mineral and Swiss Army knife of paranormality. In 2017, I started hearing stories of a tourist mine for quartz crystals in Arkansas that supposedly had all sorts of weird goings-on. At first, it was the usual spiel about crystal energy at the site, but then this energy became literal fuel for strange lights and moving, even levitating rocks. The owners of the site, a very down-home couple projecting naivete about all things paranormal, promoted the heck out of the site on podcasts, on social media, eventually appearing on a special episode of Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates. Their idea was that the crystals were producing piezoelectricity that was causing the lights and all sorts of spookiness, even sightings of Bigfoot. They later even suggested that it was a UFO refueling station. I bet the publicity worked for a while, as many more people paid to visit the site, one among many in the area. I was able to reach the Arkansas Geological Survey and uncover much of the absolute BS about this site. The mine owner frequently checked in with me to invite me to visit. Being that I was pretty certain they were hoaxing at least lights, I was not about to give them a chance to announce another geologist had been baffled. Finally, let's do a speedy run through some unusual objects and features of rocks and minerals. Some rocks have character. They ring, they explode, they look like people or really weird things, they grow or move, they have magic origins or powers. Some sands sing. Rocks take on really weird shapes that look man-made. Some of these that I've covered include eye agate, fairy stones, mimetoliths, or rocks that look like faces, and a few other bizarre and controversial features. This is the mineral starlight. It has a habit of twinning, where two crystals grow from a shared part of the crystal framework or lattice. Here, they often grow at a 90-degree angle, creating a cross shape, so they are seen to be natural crosses, and as a protective charm among their other stated magical and healing uses. In an unusual myth, the stones blend two very different customs. For the origin of the abundant crystals at Fairy Stone Park in Virginia, the story goes that the crystals are fairy tears. The fairies were visited by an elfin messenger who told them of the story of Jesus' crucifixion, and they cried tears that became crosses. When I first saw this mineral sample as it was linked to an eBay auction, I thought it was manufactured. It was just so weird. I looked up the history of it and passed the info along to a rock collector for advice. Amazingly, this piece is entirely natural, a specimen of what's called eye agate, a concentric banded form of chalcedony, which is a silica mineral from Turkey. The preparer of this piece got very lucky in the way the layers revealed themselves. The buyer, another rock collector, was lucky to get it. Obviously, such an amazing piece is endowed by many with special powers of warding off the evil eye and giving protection from curses. I was able to connect with the owner of the piece after he saw my post on it, and he loves it, sometimes wears it, and has no intention of giving it up. There are some cultures that believe rocks can be alive or hold the spirit of someone who was alive. Others think that rocks can grow or move. Moving rocks seem very strange, especially when they leave tracks. One long-standing mystery of moving rocks has been solved relatively recently. Rocks left trails as they moved across Racetrack Playa in Death Valley, California. The location was fairly difficult to get to, so only in the last 15 years or so has it been possible for people to study the conditions under which the rocks moved. There were many wild ideas prior to that about what was happening that involved magnetic fields, some other kind of earth energies, a kind of magic, or even aliens. The truth was that under particular conditions, water in the playa freezes at night, forming thin sheets of ice. The ice sheets and water allow the rocks to become buoyant enough to be pushed by the very strong winds across the flat surface, leaving a trail. No magic, just physics. There are some rocks that ring like a bell when you hit them with the hammer. A type of rock called phonolite is particularly prone to creating a metallic sound when struck. In Pennsylvania, in the highlands above the Delaware River, is a boulder field called ringing rocks. The intrusive rocks have been long exposed at the surface, and many are rounded. Some will ring, some will not. I visited the park a few months ago and saw how fascinated people were to find a true ringing rock. The cause of the ringing is not fully known, but has to do with crystal structure or internal stresses in the rock. Other internal stresses in rock slabs can cause them to literally pop. It's common for rocks to weather and fall apart because moisture works into small spaces, expands upon freezing, and wedges the rock apart. But other rocks, notably porous ones, can dramatically explode when heated, such as near a campfire. And some rock slabs, particularly granite, can exfoliate. Flat plates of rock on the surface are loosened after heating in the sun. These episodes are not generally dangerous and are common, but it is weird when it happens suddenly. Concretions are also rounded and come in all sizes, from little to giant. Sometimes they take even stranger forms, leading people to think that they're not naturally made. They often have something at their center as the nucleus that could be sand or something organic. The layers can be differentially prone to erosion, or the concretion itself may be embedded into rock layers that erode differently, causing the concretion to stick out or leave depression. Silt or clay concretions look like they were formed from liquidy blobs. Others can look like cannonballs or footprints. Some people think that they are alien devices or have magical properties. They look so mysterious. They are very weird, and it's not exactly clear why all concretions form. There's still research being done on them. And they aren't always so old. This is a concretion that formed over a few decades around a workman's hammer. However, when found near a London, Texas creek bed in the mid-1930s, it was intact. It was broken open later to reveal the entire iron hammerhead, which was from possibly 100 years prior. The mineral calcite precipitates from solution rather quickly, forming a limey clay around a nucleus. The result can be a rather modern item encased in what appears to be solid rock, but the rock is not that old. The London hammer was seized upon by creationists to use as really poor evidence that the earth is not all that old. Other out-of-place artifacts, or ooparts, include nails, chains, and other modern items. It might also explain the idea of frogs encased in stone. Of course, the creationists don't want to hear the scientific explanation. In fact, several other concretions are interpreted by creationists and young earthers to be young fossils in what science says is old rock. If we learned anything about the 21st century, it's that people can see the same thing in completely opposing ways and not budge an inch. So we've made a complete circle through spooky geology back to those alternative ideas. Even though humans have such a tendency to see meaning in nature, we have to remember that the Earth is a sphere. It has no point. Spooky geology is a way to see the Earth through a more human lens. It's one way of looking at the Earth. The science of straight geology is another. I like to check out both views as they give the most well-rounded picture of what humanity sees. I hope you enjoyed this whirlwind tour of strange and unusual ideas about the Earth. You can see there is much more mystery to examine and many delights to be found in the alternative ideas and anomalies of our planet and its products. Once again, I thank Gordon and the Edinburgh Fortean Society for hosting my talk. Please visit spookygeology.com for more about these topics and topics to come, and follow me on Twitter at IDoubtIt or the Spooky Geology Twitter account. I dream of seeing Edinburgh in person someday and visiting with you all, but until then, goodbye.
Excellent. Thank you very much for a very interesting and informative talk there, Sharon. As you've said, it's an area that's often ignored by Forteans. Hopefully this will open it up to a few more people's eyes. You mentioned one or two books, including your own and also some of the works of William Corliss. All of those, your book, the Corliss books, all of those absolutely very, very strongly recommended. If anyone's watching this live, then Sharon is actually around at the moment and she's able to answer questions on the chat function on YouTube. If you're not watching it live, I'm afraid you've missed the opportunity for questions, but please feel free to read the questions that were asked and also have a look at the description of the talk. That does include some of the links that were mentioned by Sharon at the very end there. For next month's talk, we've got something slightly different. We've got Robert Schneck. Robert is a Fortean writer. He wrote a book called The President's Vampire, and he wrote a story from there that was eventually adapted into a Hollywood film called The Bye-Bye Man, which some of you may be aware of. Robert's going to be talking to us on the 13th of October, Tuesday at 7:30, and his talk is entitled Otherwise Inexplicable, and it looks at something that's nowadays fairly well understood but in the past was not understood, and he looks at how explanations have changed over the years for what was actually happening. So very much a thing looking at evidence, and the case studies that he's going to be using are all to do with autoerotic asphyxiation. So I hope you enjoy the talk, but not perhaps the practice. Although, you know, it's a free world, whatever lights your boat, as long as you're careful and you don't end up as a statistic in one of Robert's future books. Thank you again, Sharon, for an excellent talk. Thank you everyone for listening and for watching. Hope to see you next month, and hope to see you, and indeed you as well, Sharon, at some point in the UK. Hope to see you all in the future. Thank you everyone. Bye.